To this special programme as we remember and honour those 6 million precious Jewish lives that were murdered at the hands of the Nazis on an industrial scale. In today's programme, I have a special interview with Susan Pollack, MBE, who is a Holocaust survivor. Susan, warm welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Susan, would you like to share your story? Because you were born in 1930 in Hungary.
Yes.
Can you share with us something about your Jewish parents and the Jewish family that you were brought up in?
Well, I was brought up in a village. It was a very nice and simple life. I enjoyed looking after the ducks and geese and the chickens, and being part of the domestic everyday life. I went to a local state primary school. I had my friends from my neighbors, and it was a happy childhood. Of course, being aware of the others, we were the others, but it didn't matter. We were well integrated in the community life. And my own father, he had a small little business, wood and coal, selling wood and coal, and he used to entertain us, his children. There was a brother of mine and myself, of the times when he was captured in the First World War by the Russians. And when he came back, he managed to escape. He kissed the Hungarian soil. He was so happy to be back. So that was quite frequently told to us. And it was, as I said, a happy childhood. My brother loved playing football. I liked dancing to gypsy music, the Chardash. And yeah, it was simple, good life.
And can you tell us about your parents? What's the name of your parents?
My parents, Blau, B-L-A-U. My parents, we had an Orthodox home life. What does that mean? It meant that in our we kept all our festivals. We celebrated it. It was Shabbat was a holy day for us. Children, my brother and myself, we weren't even allowed to pick up a pencil. A holy day. We went to a synagogue to pray. It was just a synagogue in that village meant a little old ramshackle place. There were only about 18 Jewish families in Fellsjögod. And we prayed. We prayed, we remembered, we learned. We learned about how to live a life. We learned about how to behave. We learned about the gratitude of life. Life is a great gift, and make a contribution.
Now, your father was very much a role model in your life. Can you tell us about your father and your love and admiration for him?
Yes. My father was a strong character, but he was quite, he was a wonderful leader, and there was no privileges in the children's upbringing, my brothers and myself, because there was nothing to share in terms, but it was a very secure home life. And my father was, for instance, in those days, having a bicycle, a motor bicycle, was a big achievement. And he needed it because he was looking at some forests where he could buy some wood and things like that. So he used that, and I occasionally sat on the back, and I felt so proud.
Fantastic. Susan, when was your first experience of encountering anti-Semitism in Hungary in the 1930s?
yes. Anti-Semitism in my life was always in the background. It's very difficult to know, but it was then, very difficult to know how would people behave under certain circumstances. On the surface, everything was okay. There were some introductions, the Jewish family, and that carried, being Jewish, carried a certain inheritance from the various things that have been enacted against the Jews. In Hungary, we had a blood libel. And a Jewish man apparently, I think it was in 1890, and a Jewish man visited a new village, and he was accused of committing a murder. Pure fabrication, pure invention. He was freed eventually. But that created an upsurge in anti-Semitic behavior in Hungary. Also, I think the fact that Hungary chose to fight in the First World War on the side of the Austro-Hungarian side, and they lost much of their territory as a result of it. The blame factor, the Jews, accusations against the Jews, and inventions of all kinds of lies. But we could live with it because we had nowhere to go, quite honestly. We had nowhere to go. As early as 1922, my brother, who was 2 years older than myself, he wanted to go to a college of further education. It wasn't open. As early as 1922. The Second World War broke out in 1939. So the difficulties against us happened long before we were transported.
And can you share what happened to your uncle, who was murdered in an anti-Semitic attack in 1938?
1938, my uncle, who lived in another village, and he was riding a wagon and horse, and somebody jumped on the wagon and took a sharp knife and cut his head into half. Well, I remember him very well. What for? Was it because he was a Jew and he was riddled with anti-Semitic lies? I don't know. A trial took place. I think he was sentenced, I think, for 2 years. They didn't speak too much about it to my parents, to us children. All we could do was shrug our shoulders and pray to God. Please, please help us. But we somehow, you know, we had hopes in the future, but it wasn't to be.
Susan, we know that, for example, Hungary sided with the Nazis during World War II. How did they implement the awful Nuremberg laws that Germany already had in discriminating against Jewish people, and including not allowing Jewish people like your brother to go to university?
Well, it was restricted. They didn't, he could not get a place at a college of further education. And there were gradual other legislations against us, such as restricting our practice in having that little business, not being able, for my brother, he couldn't go to a football match. Then Many people were dismissed from their jobs, Jewish. Public servants, Jewish, were all dismissed. In Budapest, we heard. I think even the citizenship, we were Hungarians, but that was revoked. So we lost our social rights, we lost our economic rights. How are we going to live? How is my father going to support the family? And eventually, later on, of course, we had the yellow star to wear. Identification. And there were some rumors disseminated about resettlement. Well, we didn't know. No one gave us any reliable information. What does it mean? Where to? We don't know. The local government servants were saying, we don't know. We don't know. We heard. We'll let you know. So we were deluded. We were deceived. We were abandoned.
And Susan, at the start of the outbreak of World War II, were your parents concerned about the Nazi threat that posed not only to the Jewish community but also to Hungary as well? And how much did you know about what was happening to the Jewish people on the continent of Europe as the war progressed?
Nothing. We didn't know anything about what was taking place long before Hungary decided to join the Axis alliance. Nothing at all. There were 2 escapees, actually, from Auschwitz. And unfortunately, it didn't reach us. They managed to escape because they knew that it was only the Hungarian Jews that are still left intact. So they wanted that information to be spread to all the Jews. Save yourself, go somewhere. But how long can you save yourself in a forest without support? And all we had was, we prayed. We prayed, and we were so desperate for information that we set up a seance table, calling spirits. It wasn't in our tradition to do so. So I remember it quite clearly, that we had little chits of paper. Are we going to survive? Somehow we felt that something intolerable is going to happen to us. Why? Because the demonstrations outside and the caricatures about the Jews and the accusations grew, and it just overwhelmed the population. There were the fascists that gained credence in Hungary.
And what was it like then, living in Hungary and seeing anti-Semitic graffiti on the walls and hearing radio broadcasts that were only described as full of Jew hatred, the rise of fascism, and also your brother was badly beaten up by fascists as well. Can you describe what happened to him?
Well, my brother was badly beaten up. I think he tried to sneak into a football match, and he was beaten up when he came out with a gang of his friends, former friends. And when he was complaining, oh, the local government, they didn't take any responsibility. They're just thugs, pay no attention. We lived in fear. We were desperate. We had no support whatsoever from anyone. There were people, perhaps, who had opportunity to be hidden by others, but it didn't happen to us.
And can you describe what happened when the Nazis invaded Hungary in 1944?
In 1944, yes, I personally haven't seen any Germans at all. By then the war was coming to an end. The Allied forces had landed. and quickly occupied Europe. So we didn't really, I don't know how much knowledge was available, because all the news was censored. And all we could see and hear is that the Germans were so victorious and quickly and they're going to retaliate for what took place. But so we had hoped. We had hoped that the Allied forces would come and rescue us. Somehow, didn't happen in time for us. It was just a matter of a couple of months. We were so close to the end of the war.
Susan, during the siege of Budapest and during the Nazi invasion of Hungary, you said before that you didn't see one Nazi. So who was doing the roundup of the Jewish people? Was it ordinary Hungarians who decided to collaborate with the Nazis?
Yes, ordinary Hungarian gendarmerie. Eventually, Horthy, who was the chancellor, had less control, and the Hungarian fascist party, the Nyilosok called. These were the local-bred Nazis. They took over, and the numbers grew in Hungary. So it was just a matter of, and we could hear. We placed our hopes and trust on the Russians who were close to the border, and we thought, thank God that they're attacking Hungary. You could hear the explosions in Hungary, in Budapest. It was just a matter of a short time, but it was done by the Hungarian civil servants.
Yeah. And Susan, can you share with us what happened to the Jewish community and what happened to your family? Were you rounded up and put into a ghetto?
We were rounded up. We had been told, as I said earlier, that we're going to be resettled, and when that took place, there was a meeting called, or at least we had some notification from the local council in Felsögöd that this meeting will discuss this resettlement program, but they didn't mind. The Jews didn't trust them anymore. But nevertheless, they thought it's better to know, whatever that means. They attended the meeting. A few hours later, the rest of the family had been called. My mum, my brother, myself, together with a few other ladies, Jewish women, we went, and I had seen my father being brutally beaten up in front of my eyes. I was a little girl. And herded onto a waiting lorry. I hadn't seen him since. We weren't allowed to use the public transport anymore, even with the yellow star, which I've sewn on. I was reasonably efficient with these things, you know, sewn on everything that we wore outside. And so we were left on our own. My father was making the decisions for us, what to do. We were totally at loss. And he was the one who said, somehow, we sent a Christian lady to take a basket of food to him, because we knew where he was, where they were taken to. And the lady came back, and she says, just as well you hadn't seen your husband, because he was unrecognizable. They were so brutal to the men. Lack of food, emaciated in a relatively short time. And then we were called to proceed with this resettlement. I recently, well, 2 years ago, I learned that they were all taken to Auschwitz to be exterminated. So, that is my memory of my father. The Hungarian gendarmerie came. Now it's our turn to get ready. Pack your bags with the bare essentials, because we're the only ones to carry the things, no luggages, just in a sheet. I'm carrying this single sewing machine on my back, a little girl, thinking perhaps it will be useful to support my family. And the following morning we were taken away under a Hungarian guard, taken to a ghetto, a former Jewish school, where I had been going for a while, very short time, a Jewish school. There were 80 students standing up, listening to one teacher. I learned nothing. I could hear nothing. That was my education.
How did your mother reassure you and your brother in the ghetto of what was going on?
We just continued praying. And she became, unfortunately, perhaps for the good, voiceless. We couldn't explain it. There was no way we could make sense of it. And we accepted. You cling to little hopes. This resettlement somewhere, perhaps we could continue living. And one has to cling to some hope. Perhaps just hold on a bit longer, we were telling ourselves. We'll arrive somewhere. But when having been placed, all of us, with many thousands of others, in this open, disused mine, we were sleeping outdoors there for a few days, and then walked a long way to the cattle train. The doors were shut. That was in 1944, June. The doors were shut, there was no fresh air, it was hot. Then we realized we were trapped. There was no escape. We were trapped. But again, we thought, what is going on? There was no answer. There was no answer. We just prayed and hardly could voice our devotion. Many of us died along the way, especially the children, babies, lack of water. And by then, I think we probably had been giving up on life.
And what were the conditions like in these cattle trains?
We had 2 buckets. There were about 80 people on a straw. That was straw floor, hardly anywhere to sit down. One drinking water, 1 bucket, the other for some human soil. Of course, they all spilled. There was no replacement of water. Dehydration took place, of course, and people died. They died. Kids were dying. Death all around us. And it was a place of great loss, feeling of despair. Can't describe it. We had no voices anymore to express that. Just pray. Do not abandon us. Let us live. Let us live the gift of life. It was so much valued.
And Susan, what happened when you arrived at the notorious Nazi death camp known as Auschwitz, Birkenau?
Yes, Finally, when the doors opened up, in a way we were lucky, we survived. And we could breathe some fresh air. And we thought, relieved. But the terror hit us immediately. Indescribable, the fear, the terror, and the aggression that was bombarding us by the Nazis. We left everything. We brought a few things that we brought. We managed to bring from home to make our lives a bit easier. Was all left there, and selection took place. My brother was selected for slave labor, Sonderkommando, 2 years older than myself, a young, able-bodied young man. What does that mean, Sonderkommando? Shoveling bodies who had been gassed into the gas chamber. My brother became psychologically affected. He survived, but just about. He never spoke about it. And myself, I was sent with girls. I was reasonably tall. I was saying I'm more than 15 years old. So I survived for a while. How? Stark naked, we girls, at the parade in front of Dr. Mengele. We knew that if we're going to be selected and put with a group on the side, that means being gassed. So we used to pinch our cheeks, stood straight, quickly tried to pass by his gaze.
What happened to your mother?
My mother was gassed. My mother, how do I know? Because we were all placed after that initial selection. I was placed in a large barrack, which is still there, in Birkenau, and the girls, the Hungarian girls, some of them who had been transported before us, asked me, "What happened to your mother?" And I said, "She was selected with a group of young mothers and many children and babies." "Oh, well, she was gassed." And I never cried. The emotions seized up within me. I was dehumanized from the moment I was landed in Auschwitz. There was nothing familiar. Everything was unknown. It wasn't operating. There was no moral justification for anything that they were doing to us. Why? And so I wasn't thinking. I became a robot, just doing what I was told to do. Don't speak. And when you do, whisper, because you weren't allowed to speak. And what that meant, this selection in front of him, meant death if we don't pass. So we behaved accordingly. Little girls. On one occasion, I was selected, but I wasn't fearful anymore. I just acted. Selected for slave labor for a short while. For a short while, sent to a large German city, Guben, I think it was called, because no one told me anything. We were just walking and listening. There was no information, no reliable information, no information at all, because no one had any information. You weren't allowed to express yourself. When the Allied forces were coming close, I think. We were sent on this death march in the winter 44-45.
Can you describe what conditions were like at the munitions factory? What kind of, I mean, please can you give us an understanding? Did the Germans give you any food to eat? And, you know, what did you eat? And how did you manage to keep your spirits up under what I can only describe as hell on earth?
Well, of course, it had improved. The food, the quality and the quantity of the food in this working camp had improved because we had nothing in Auschwitz. A little scrap of bread in the morning if we were lucky, and maybe some dishwater type of soup in the evening. So we were losing weight. Here, I was doing some work. And we marched up to the factory every morning. People who had seen us, under guard, of course, always, and nobody came to help us or anything. But the quality and the quantity of the food had improved. So, and of course, we were in a guarded area, and I think we slept in. I don't really have much recollection. But we had somewhere to sleep indoors. Yeah, we did. Just like animals, going to work, getting some food, walking back.
Do you think the local German population understood what was happening, particularly these horrendous concentration camps and forced slave labour? Do you think the local communities were aware of what was happening to you and the other Jewish people?
Definitely. They were aware. They must have been aware. Because we walked. We were in that big city. They could see we were slave laborers. And many of the large German companies, who are still in existence, had used us. I was doing work, for instance, they showed me some simple checking, testing some instruments. It was made for somebody, and many, and quite a few of the German companies had knowledge that the slave laborers, us, should have a function. Yeah.
And as the Allied forces were approaching from the west, the British and the Americans, and then the Russians from the east, you were forced on the death march. Can you describe what that march was like, marching to the notorious Nazi death camp, Bergen-Belsen?
Yes, it was in 1944-45, bitter cold. We had no clothes, no clothes, no warm clothes or proper shoes to wear. And under Nazi guard, we had been ordered to march, and it was freezing. No food hardly, so we used to scrape for food in the frozen fields that looked like perhaps buried potatoes or turnips. And if we had been caught to do that, we were shot. Many of us fell and were shot in front of our eyes. They couldn't keep up. Occasionally, when we were lucky, we could find some shelter in barns, but it didn't happen too often. And it went on for a long time, this walking. So by the time we got somewhere, at least we got somewhere, because it was freezing and not many of us left anymore. When we walked into the place of death, the place of extreme, I wouldn't even say pain, because we didn't have feelings anymore. We just walked. We walked in, and we were told to lie down or sit down there. Mountains of corpses. All all the diseases were raging. All you could hear was moaning and sighing and crying and pleading. That was the only sound to be heard. No food distribution. Infectious diseases were taking more mountains of corpses. That's my memory, where I was. But somehow I was able to crawl out. I wasn't able to walk anymore. I crawled out from that barrack because the conditions were so intolerable. And I crawled into the next barrack. And for the first time in a year, who do I see but my Jewish neighbor? And she recognized me. And she said, Susan, my Hungarian name, Zsuzsi, do you think we're going to survive? And I found a voice. I didn't think I had it anymore. Just hold on a bit longer. Well, I couldn't stay there because someone else wanted that tiny little space that I was occupying, so I crawled back to my barrack. The following day, I wanted to be with her, but she had lice all over, an indication she was dead. And the British Army liberated us. They were very good. Quickly, they organized relief help by having a few small ambulances to see if there is a twitch in the body of a survivor. And I crawled out. I remember that quite vividly. I wanted to die outside, I suppose. And the soldier saw the twitch in my body, picked me up. And to this day, I just can't get over that goodness. And I'm asking myself, what put that goodness into his heart to help us and help us to live and to place value on us? So there are a few memories of kindness, goodness, generosity, decency, and unity that helped me to retain my humanity, my hope. Somehow there might be a better future if I'm allowed to live.
And when you were liberated by the British and also shown incredible kindness by that British soldier, how did you feel at that time? Did you feel that the war is over now and you've been liberated and a new life can begin?
Well, I wasn't sort of thinking too much at first, but as the food improved and I was able to use my mind, and I thought, what am I going to do with my life? My mom, she was gassed. I knew that. My father, I didn't know that he was dead, but I wasn't holding out too much hopes, having seen that terrorist, the machination of the terror state. Who's going to look? Where shall I go? And that was a big, big, big problem. I depended totally on the kindness of others. Completely. And they were helpful.
And Susan, after the war, you were sent to Sweden. Can you share with us your experiences of being in Sweden?
Yes, yes, I was lucky. I was very lucky that Sweden, being a neutral country, had sent in a medical boat with stretchers and took us, the survivors, and offered a place of rehabilitation, physical and mental as well. The process of feeling like a human being again was actually reinstated not to a great extent, by the doctor who took me out and taught me how to walk again. And he turned to me and he said, "I've got a daughter like you." I couldn't believe it. Me, being compared to his daughter. What a discovery. So these kind words of acceptance was a journey to go forward.
Amazing. And then you moved to Canada, where you met your husband, who was a fellow survivor.
That's right. I moved to Canada. I was sent to Canada. I wanted to go to Israel, where I could feel safe, where I could feel protected. But I wasn't well enough. I wasn't strong enough to drain the marshes, because there was still malaria there and digging the ground. I just couldn't do it physically. So they sent me to Canada. I met my husband, who was also a survivor of Mauthausen. And I got married when I was 18 years old. And we started work and an appreciation. And gradually, I mean, no education, no language, no skill, no support system. Not easy. How do you get stand on your feet? But marrying, I think in my case, I hope I was a big help to my husband. He passed away 2.5 years ago. And he was a skilled man. Together we created a family.
Amazing. Susan, thank you so much for sharing your very compelling, very powerful and very emotional story with us today.
I became a Samaritan when I came to live here.
Fantastic. And can you tell us, when did you decide to start talking and sharing about your experiences so that future generations will know first-hand accounts of what the Nazis did over 70 years ago during the Second World War?
Yes. For many reasons, I did not do it at first. First of all, I had my children quite young. And myself also, I had to develop that trust, that acceptance, not just for my own sake, but for my children's sake as well. I think I had hoped not to instill any form of hatred in their heart. There was no audience to listen to it. I mean, the Second World War took many casualties. So survivorship wasn't very much on the agenda. And I had to work, didn't have time to do it. And so there was a long time where I couldn't really face it. It was only by coming here to Britain, when we worked and had succeeded in creating a secure life for my children, that about 30 years ago, that there was an increased need for the population here to know, and organizations sprung up to assist us to do that.
Susan, I just want to thank you for your courage and your bravery in speaking up. Now, it must have been absolutely wonderful to receive an MBE from the Queen for your services in telling a number of different generations about what happened during the Holocaust, so that something as horrific as that never happens again. What was it like to meet the Queen and receive your award?
It was indescribable, the joy. I was in Buckingham Palace, and so we were kind of trained a little bit how to behave ourselves, how to walk forward, and so on and so on. And towards the end, before I was called in, I was on my own in the hall in Buckingham Palace, and the announcement came through: Susan Pollack for services to the Holocaust, and music started. And it was just a miracle in my mind. A miracle. I shall never forget it. I'm talking to myself very slowly. Susan, we're living in a new world. Susan, it's no longer a danger to talk about yourself being a Jew. And it was just the most wonderful, wonderful acceptance that the Holocaust can be taught, and there are people wanting to know and listening to those hard, hard years. And seeing my face, I'm a human being. I want to make contribution to a place where I live.
You have done. Susan, today has been a very special interview, and it's been very special for me personally to hear your incredible and remarkable story. And I want to say, as a Christian Zionist, a Christian who loves Israel and the Jewish people, thank you for telling your story. Thank you for all that you do in talking to the likes of government departments and the London Assembly and others about your story. And in Hebrew, kol hakavod to you for all that you've done. So thank you for watching today's program.
Shalom to you. God bless you. When I walk the streets, what do I say? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He lays me down in the still waters. Justice. Who will ascend the mountain of righteousness? Only those with clean hands and a pure heart. I say that to me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Susan. And I just want to thank you for watching this special programme as we remember the horrors that took place in the Holocaust. And it's powerful testimonies like Susan's that we can overcome evil by knowing what happened over 70 years ago on the continent of Europe to ensure that something like this never happens again.
Praise God.
This moment, only in my dreams, you're missing, but you're always a heartbeat from me. Now without you, I don't know where you are. I keep watching, I keep hoping, but time Is there a road I could follow to bring you back home? Winter lies before me, now you're so far away. In the darkness of my dreaming, the light of you will stay. If I could be close beside you, if I could be where you are, if I could reach out and touch you and bring you back home. Is there a way I can find you? Is there a sign I should know? Is there a